So with that, Mr. Kris Johnson is going to be giving, no, just wait. It's not his turn yet. I still have a microphone. Stay there, Mr. Johnson. In honor of Mr. Johnson, I have a joke. Ready? Who was the greatest comedian in the Bible? Samson, because he brought the house down.
Not bad, not bad. You know, just if we're having a competition, we're going to have to bring it, Kate, with the announcements, so with the jokes. How's everyone doing this morning? All right. Would you pray with me? Lord, I just want to thank you for this morning, and I just really lift this message to you. I pray, Lord, that it would just be a great morning, and that you would just, your words would be spoken, that your Holy Spirit would be present, and we just love you and thank you for everything that you've given to us, and we just lift this time to you in your name. Amen. All right, so, I know in past messages I've told you that I love the Old Testament, and the reason I love it is because the Bible is so full of character profiles that we can sit there and identify with people who lived thousands of years ago, but the truths still ring true today. The only thing that separates us is time and technology, right? But we're really pretty much the same people, no matter the time period we live in and who we are. We're all looking pretty much for the same thing. We're looking for purpose, we're looking for identity, we're looking for community, and we're looking for love. And those are really the basics of what we're looking for just as people in general. And one of the things that's so awesome about the Bible is it brings this alive in ways that we really can't understand. Because when it comes from the Bible, it has the power of God in it, right? I mean, there's always a physical aspect that we have in life, but we're far more spiritual beings than we are physical. And so when we're dealing with issues in life, flaws or weaknesses, it's usually not the physical things that bring the comfort. It's the emotional and the spiritual, right? I mean, that's really where the healing comes. So we're going to be talking in the New Testament today, and in this case, it's Jesus approaching someone who's been completely discarded by society. What I love about Jesus is when he goes to these communities, he walks into these areas where people who typically are considered worthless or no one would have anything to do with, Jesus approaches them in a way where it's like, hey, you know what? It's kind of like, American Pickers, which is one of my favorite TV shows. It really is, because what these guys do is they go into these barns, they find stuff that's been sitting in there for 50, 60 years, and they pull it out, and to them, it's treasure. But to a lot of people, what winds up happening is this is just old junk that they don't even want to deal with. And these guys take it and repurpose it, and all of a sudden, something that was rusty and old and junky is now a treasure that someone's willing to pay top dollar for. And in this case, Jesus is walking into this region where there's this little man. His name is Zacchaeus. And I just want to kind of tee this up for you because there's some background that you kind of need to know about this. So during this time, when Jesus goes into all these little towns and hamlets and everything else, what you have to understand is these people, the Jewish people at this time, are really beaten down because they're occupied by the Romans. And up until that time, they've been hearing about this great rescuer that's going to rescue them, and they're thinking in their minds they're going to basically be saved from the Roman government, the incredibly oppressive army that they have. But what happens is people are starting to realize that Jesus isn't going to sit there and free them from a physical occupation. What he's doing is he's freeing them from a spiritual occupation. And so here's what winds up happening. He goes into this region. There's all these people that want to see him, right? And they're all clamoring to get a look at him. And if you've ever been to, like, say, a rock concert, matter of fact, Leah one of my daughters, we went to go see a Pink Floyd tribute concert here at Walworth County during the winter. And there were a ton of people there. And because I'm like 6'4", I could see over all these people and I could see the stage. But Leah couldn't. And so all these people were looking at her and, oh my gosh, she's got this red hair, and led her up by the stage. And she literally was so close to these musicians that she could have like touched them. And that's what Zacchaeus wanted. He wanted to see Jesus, but he couldn't because he's just this little guy. So he climbs up this tree. But here's the deal with Zacchaeus. He's a tax collector. And if you don't know what tax collectors were treated like back then, it was pretty much the lowest of the low. They were lower than like the prostitutes. And the reason is because if you were a Jewish tax collector back then, you were considered a traitor. You were an agent for the Roman government. And basically what it is you worked for the Roman government. So you would collect taxes for a government that was oppressing you. And not only that, to make matters worse, they would pad the amount of money that they would collect from you. So let's say you owed $75 to the Roman government. They would charge you $100. They'd give the Roman government $75. They would keep $25. And they knew this was very common practice. But the Romans didn't care, because as long as they got their pound of flesh, who cares? You keep whatever you want as long as we get the quota that we need. The Jews hated this, because not only when they saw a tax collector, it reminded them of, number one, they're being occupied by a foreign government, but number two, their very own people are taking their money, giving it to that government, and then they're also taking a cut of it. So they just looked at these people with just incredible hatred. So he climbs up this tree, and Jesus sees him. And we're going to be talking out of Luke 19 today. And so I'm going to read a portion of this, and I want to just share with you kind of the background of what's going on. So Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached that spot, he looked up to him and said, "Hey, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. But all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be a guest of a sinner." So you have to kind of understand that with the Jewish culture back then, touching anything that was like unclean, so being with people who would be considered sinners, they'd have to go through this like ceremonial cleaning all the time. And it was one of these deals where if you associated with people like this, it was not good. A tax collector would be probably the lowest of the low. So Jesus sits there and looks at this man and says, "Hey, I want to come and I want to have dinner with you." And it drove not only the people crazy, but as we go into the scriptures deeper, we're going to realize that the Pharisees couldn't stand this. Because when Jesus came into these regions, he kind of took over their authority. What's interesting about the Pharisees as well is that, no, they didn't collect money like the tax collector, but in their own way, they were also treasonous in the eyes of the Jewish people, because what they did is they were kind of hired by the Roman government to keep the peace. Even though they kept Jewish law and things like that, the Romans could see the value of having the Pharisees amongst the people so that they just didn't have to deal with riots and chaos and everything else. So really what the Pharisees were really interested in was just keeping their power, keeping their position, and making sure that if they could just keep these people down, they would still have their elevated position. Even though they really didn't care, they worked with the Roman government, even though they occupied, their land. The Pharisees were really no different than the tax collector. One of the things that's so interesting about Jesus is how he interacts with people. when he interacts with these people, he knows that there's sin and flaws and all these issues in their life, right? But he is not judgmental. You can look at all these different examples that we've seen when Jesus deals with the woman at the well, or Zacchaeus, or other people, the disciples, all highly flawed people that he saw value in. But what's interesting about Jesus is he doesn't sit there and highlight all the things that are wrong with them. What he really does is he says, I need you to be honest with yourself. And once you're honest with yourself, then you can be honest with me. You see what I'm saying? You can't put the cart before the horse, because God already knows everything about our life. It's not like he has any secrets about us. He knows already. But what he wants is he wants us to be honest with ourselves before we're honest with him. So I'm going to share a story with you that happened to me when I was in high school. And I will tell you, being honest with yourself can be a very dangerous thing. It can have unexpected consequences. Usually they're good. But let's face it, when there's change, whether it's good or bad, change is stressful, isn't it? I mean, it just is. If you got an inheritance, it's stressful because it's like, oh, now I have the responsibility of what to do with money. Or if you lose a job, that's stressful as well. And what happens is Jesus sits there and kind of reverses this mirror. Instead of having the mirror on him, he takes a spiritual mirror and reverses it so you can see what's going on in your own life. So when I was in high school, I grew up at a very large church here in Walworth County, and I hung around a group of very entitled kids, and we were troublemakers, to say the least. The leadership of the church actually nicknamed us the Church Mafia, and that is the truth. That's exactly what they called us. And so one night, this is in the mid to early 80s, the big thing back then was to go and toilet paper egg people's homes. And there was a guy who we grew up with who their parents happened to be very wealthy bank presidents from Chicago, and this guy had it coming. So we went out, and they had a very nice home on Lake Geneva. And so my friend and a few of our acquaintances loaded up the car, and we parked at a neighborhood that was adjacent to this very ritzy neighborhood in Lake Geneva. And back then, if you remember, Chevy Chevettes were a very common car during the late 70s and early 80s. And so we park in this neighborhood. We go to this house, we do this job, and we start coming back along the lake path, and for whatever reason, out of the corner of my eye, I could see all this activity around this car that was my friend's. I'm like, wait, hey, hang on. So we look over this like little bluff right on the lake, and there are all these cops all over this car. And so I'm like, we got to wait. So we sit there and we're talking, along the lake path until they're done with whatever they're doing, and then we go back to the car. So we had a few other jobs we had to do that night, and we went to a gas station, and it was actually that little gas station right next to the Chinese restaurant in Lake Geneva. And there's a reason why that's important. So we buy more toilet paper. We're pulling out, and my friend backs into a car. We get out, and I'm looking at this car, and it's this piece of junk car, and I'm like, dude, we're not calling the cops. This thing is not worth anything. But the guy insisted, and before we knew it, the police were there. Okay, so they do the report, and they happen to notice the car and the license plate, and they said, hey, we happen to notice this car that you guys are in, and it was a very heavily burglarized neighborhood recently, and we'd just like to know what you were doing there. And, we're all looking at each other, and, and they're like, why don't you we're going to just have you follow us down to the police station, and we're going to just chat with you for a while. So we find ourselves in this interrogation room. Now, they didn't put the restraints on us. But where we found ourselves that night was in this room where they had these big wood chairs where they had like the ankle and the arm bracelets. And the thing that I remember the most is in the back of this room, there was this huge display case of all these like knives and guns and drug paraphernalia that they had like confiscated over like the course of the years. It was just on display like these awards or something. And so they sit down and they're like, okay, so why don't we start talking? I'm going to stop the story there, and I'm going to go back to Zacchaeus really quick. So we're back to Jesus and Zacchaeus. And when we start looking at what's happening to the reaction that these people are having, they can't stand the fact that Jesus is being upfront and honest with a guy that they hate. If you look at verse 8, it says, "But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, 'Look, Lord, here I am now, and I will give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I had cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount.'" When I read that, and I sit there and I look at a guy who basically has been discarded by his own people, and rightfully so. He took up an occupation that he knew. He traded worldly wealth for the fact of being a part of a community and staying faithful to his nationality. And can you imagine, think about this if you were Zacchaeus. What kind of people do you think you're going to have as friends? You're going to be around fellow tax collectors, thieves, prostitutes, people who are considered the low lives of that society. So you got to think, if they're going to be that way with other people, they're going to be that way with you, right? I mean, a lot of what we tell our kids is so much of it is who you hang around with. It's really not so much what you do. And so it's got to be a very lonely existence for Zacchaeus. Whatever friends he has, they're really not going to be real friends. They're not going to be those type of people you could go to at 3 in the morning and say, "I really need some help." So I'm sure Zacchaeus is really looking for people to share his life with. And he sees Jesus coming down. And Jesus is like, "Hey, wait a minute. I want to get to know you." And everyone's like, "What? Why would you want to get to know this guy?" And I'm sure Zacchaeus was just as surprised. Like, you're a rabbi. You're Jesus. You're the one who's been committing all these miracles and doing all these things, and you want to talk to me? Really? So you can see how surprised people would be. We talked about being honest, and one of the things that I'm realizing as I'm getting older is when I pray to God, one of the things that I do is I speak verbally in my prayers, just like I'm talking to you guys. Like I have to say it out loud. And the reason I have to do it is sometimes when I do that, there are things that come out of my mouth, not bad things, but revelations that God gives me. Like, holy cow, I didn't really realize that about myself. And there's been so many times where God has whispered and said, "I know, but I needed you to know it first before I could change anything in your life." So when that happens, it's almost like you see a spiritual mirror just materialize in front of you, and you start to see all these things in your life where it's like, "Hey, Kris, I'm going to reveal these certain things to you, but I'm only going to do it as long as you can handle it." Because if he overloaded us with everything that we have in our lives, we would be overwhelmed, wouldn't we? We would be drowning in despair and looking at things with regrets and all the things that are in front of us. And I look at it and I'm like, wow, there is a lot of stuff, God, that you knew about me that I didn't even know. And I'm starting to understand how this is all like working out in my life. And that's exactly what happened to Zacchaeus. This is a guy who has been stealing. He has been considered, the lowest of the low. And he comes to kind of, I don't want to use a cliche, but a coming to Jesus moment where that mirror starts to materialize in front of him. He's like, I've been living a life that really has been a lie. I've been cheating people. I turned my back on my nation. And this man comes and it's like, rocks my world. And not only will I pay back what I've cheated, but I'm going to give back even more just to offset all of the things that I've done in my life. And this is stuff that people back then couldn't handle. The Pharisees were just like, I can't deal with this, because Jesus comes into these communities and he just turns everything upside down. They don't know what to do with this guy. Like, everything that he's doing, it's like, what are we supposed to do? These people are reacting to them like we've never seen before. But it's because God is convicting them to say, I need you to be honest with yourself, and then you can be honest with me. And that's life-changing stuff. But it comes at a cost. All right. So my friends and I are sitting in these chairs. And for whatever reason, I don't know, I really wasn't all that stressed out about it, but my other friends were like panicking. And they're asking us a series of these questions of, what were you doing in this neighborhood? They're coming up with every imaginable lie you could think of. And so what was happening is they had a guy on a CB radio back then, and they would be like, oh, yeah, we went to go visit so-and-so, and the guy's like, oh, I know that family. You know what? I'm going to have our dispatcher call them and just see if you went, and that's exactly what they did. And there were probably 3 or 4 of these scenarios, and every one of them was blown out of the water. And I looked at my friends, and I just said, look, why don't we just tell them the truth? Why don't we just be honest with them and just say, this is what we did? And they were getting really mad at me. They were just like, no, we're not doing that. I don't do it. And it got to the point where finally I could just tell we were not getting anywhere with the Lake Geneva Police Department. And I just said, officer, I'm just going to tell you flat out, this is what we did. We went to this address. This guy's a personal friend of ours. And we just, went off on this guy's house. And so I could see, you could tell the deputy was just like, all right, we'll go check it out. You know, he's on the phone, the CB radio. And within minutes, we could hear over the speaker, the story checks out. And by the way, tell them they did an awesome job in that house. But see, here's the thing. Being honest has consequences that we don't expect, right? In that case, the consequences were positive. But I'm going to tell you, I think if I hadn't had the initiative to just be honest with these cops, I don't know what would have happened. I think we would have been let go. I think they knew we weren't burglars. But all they wanted was just honesty. They just wanted someone to be transparent and say, what were you guys doing? Just tell us, because we can tell you're not telling us the truth. They could see it. But we had to be honest with ourselves before we could be honest with those cops. And we were let go. There was no tickets. There was nothing. We just, life went on as normal. When you think about how Jesus digs into our life, and I will tell you, I am guilty of this as anyone else. We focus so much on the things of this world, how people have hurt us, how we've hurt people, things that we have fallen on, whether it's addictions or codependency or how we've treated people or expectations we've had on people. The fact is that we're all guilty of it, right? And I'm going to tell you that my relationship with those kids that I was friends with back in high school, it did change. It didn't change for the better, by the way, either. Because what happened was that they didn't trust me that when we would go out and do stuff that I would keep my mouth closed. And so over the course of my high school career, and some of them I even went to college with, after that incident in Lake Geneva, it wasn't the same anymore. But I felt that it was so important to be honest. One, because I wanted to get out of there and I was tired. But number two, I can't sit here and just keep lying about what I've done because they know it's not true and we know it's not true. And it's the exact same thing with God. He sees us for what we are. We're fallen human people that he loves, that he would do anything for. But sometimes he's got to take and shake us and be like, look, I already know everything. You don't have to worry about it. I'm not sitting here looking at you like you've got to be perfect in order for me to love you and accept you. But what I need from you is just to be honest with yourself. This is where you're at. And once you can get to that point, I can start working with you. I can start being a force in your life where you can start healing from all the hurts, all the pains. Yeah, some of them are your fault, some of them aren't your fault. But in order for me to work with that, you've got to take that first step. And that's exactly what Zacchaeus did. He knew already what he was. He already knew that people looked down on him. And then here you have a person like Jesus who comes and it's like, whoa. And the Pharisees are like, whoa. And everyone else is like, whoa. And that's the thing. With Jesus, it's always a whoa moment. Isn't it? I mean, isn't it really? When you think about everything that the world has to offer that's supposed to change your life, and it doesn't. It just doesn't. And then Jesus comes into the picture, and he just like, the whole thing is in pieces. The chains are gone. All these weird, oppressive things start to disintegrate and heal, and you're just like, where was this my whole life? And I will tell you, as a Christian who's been raised in the church my whole life, the Christians are probably the ones that don't draw in this anywhere near as much as the people who have just accepted Christ as their Savior. Because when you're raised in the church, and I'll just speak for myself, you take it for granted. You don't realize the power that you have until you really hit rock bottom. And I know I've shared with you on many and several of you guys that a few years ago I had a horrible bout with depression. And I will tell you, what brought me out of it was being thankful. It wasn't focusing on the things I didn't have or focusing on the things that I wanted. It was like God is saying, look, I can free you of this, but you've got to be honest with yourself. You've got to start being thankful, and you've got to start realizing who you are. And then when that mirror materializes, now you can start to see what I see in you. So, the Zacchaeus moment. When you go through this week, I want you to maybe write down a few Zacchaeus moments that you've had in your life. Maybe you haven't even had one yet. And maybe you need to ask God and just say, hey, like King David said, search me, O God. Let me see what you see so I can be honest with myself. If a little Jewish tax collector like Zacchaeus can do it, there's no reason why we can't do it. That's the thing. Those are the kind of character profiles in the Bible that just rock my world. Because we're no different than those people back then. The only thing that is different is time and technology, but we are the same people. So as you go through this week, ask God, let me see who I am. Let me be honest with myself. And I want to see that spiritual mirror, God, that only you can see. And let God share with you what it is, because he will do it. I've seen it, and I will tell you, it can be scary. It can be very intimidating, but it can rock your world, just like it did Zacchaeus.